Okay, so if you looked at the code yesterday, there could be a little bit of confusion because they talk a lot about, we see it here, pallet transaction pane. These are the pallets. Remember we talked about pallets being building blocks. Pallet pseudo trait for runtime. Palette template trait for runtime, and then there was also balances, and a grandpa I think is in there as well. Let me see. I know it's in there. Here, palette grandpa trait for runtime. So let me try to clear up that confusion because it was confusing me, and I would imagine it's confusing some of you. First of all, let's understand what traits are in Rust. A trait is essentially an interface, and define it as behavior. A type's behavior consists of the methods we call in that type. Different types share the same behavior if we can call the same methods on those types. Trait definitions are a way to group method signatures together to define behaviors necessary to accomplish some purpose. So they're similar to interfaces. Now, so we understand what that is. If you're familiar with Java, C, other programming languages. Now, what's interesting is in this article, they talk about pallets, and this is why we're at this trait we see throughout the code, which is using pallets. Every pallet has a component called trait that is used for configuration. This component is a Rust trait interface. Frame developers must implement this trait for each pallet they would like to include in a runtime in order to configure that pallet with the parameters and types it needs from the outer runtime. For instance, a template pallet that is included in node template, you'd see the following trait. So pub trait frame system trait. And you might have a type event. And it has various things. So, how does this work in terms of the code? Hopefully you saw that. So we saw this trait, subtrait trait. Pub trait in the pallets. So let's look at this let's look at the grandpa, which is critical in a Polkadot type substrate blockchain. So implement pallet grandpa. We're implementing a trait. We're implementing the configuration interface. So it's an interface that we're saying that you have to define for runtime to use the grandpa palette. And you can see in here we define all these different types and all these different properties that the grandpa needs in order to perform what it's needs to do. Timestamp. So we have to include moment, on timestamp, minimum period, balances. So we have to include max locks, the balance, and various things we have to configure. So same thing with payments, and then we have the runtime constructor, and we do define a bunch of other types. We implement various things that transaction pool, the off-chain, all the various things that you need within, let's see. So here, look at this. This is pallet transaction. Let's look at this pallet transaction payment. RPC run, okay. So the query info here takes a block and returns this balance pallet. Is this what I was looking for? So let's see. This does use the pallet transaction payment, which we defined. Here's another where we use the grandpa authority list. We defined that up here when we're talking about grandpa. Let's see if I can find it. And it could be way up here where we're doing use. But again, we have to use it, and if we're using it, we have to configure it, or it's not gonna, yeah. Use pallet grandpa and the authority list. So this is hopefully cleared up some confusion if you sat down and looked at the code, and give you a little idea of how you actually use these pallets in actual code. So hopefully this was useful. If it was, please give me a like, and if you want to see more, please subscribe. And again, hope this was useful, and thank you. Take care.